let's give a round of applause for Joel as he shares with us from his heart.
I'm gonna tell you a story. And I don't particularly like waiting for the ending of a story. So I'm gonna tell you a story about Joel in second grade. And because I like to read the spoilers of movies, I flip to the end of books and I read like the last 2 pages. I'm gonna give you the spoiler for this story. A story about a day that changed my life. And this story ends with second grade Joel pooping his pants. Some of you are like, I don't know whether or not to applaud that, or what do we do with that? I grew up a gassy child. And when you're growing up, you go through phases where as a kid, it's excusable, you get a little bit older, and then farts become funny. Maybe you got a parent who encourages this, and then you hit that phase where you're being brought out in public, and your parents realize that farts are no longer funny, because older ladies are like, your child is just way too gassy to be out in this McDonald's right now. And they're like, you can't just do that. You gotta say, excuse me, and like kind of hold it in. But still, that just makes it funnier, makes it even better. So this particular day, it's second grade, and I am going through the day, and my stomach feels a little bit weird. I get these little pains, rumbles and grumbles, if you will, right? And it just feels like normal gas. But I've been taught by my parents, who were ashamed of me, only when I was gassy, loving family, to not just let it rip whenever you want to. So I'm in school, and I'm like, all right, I need to keep this under control. But I'm going through the whole day, and I'm not really eating lunch, and it just feels bad, it feels rough. I'm feeling just anxiety because I'm like, man, something is going on. And the whole day, I just am kind of clutching my stomach. Well, we get to math class, and we are just about at the end of the day. Everything has been going fine, but I'm not feeling the best. And I'm like, I have to do this. Otherwise, my stomach's going to explode out the front. And so we're in a transition period. When you were in elementary school, you'd have like, hey, we're going to go from one subject to another, so people are shifting desks. Maybe they're putting art smocks away. They're getting out colored pencils. They're getting notebooks. It's one of those things, and I'm like, ooh, it's noisy. So I'm like, this is my moment. And it was silent, but it was deadly. And I learned that day what diarrhea was. I mean, you're like, oh, but like, when did you have that conversation, When one of your parents is like, hey, stomach bugs can come out the top, or, you don't know. And suddenly there's this moment where like, oh no, this is really bad. And tell you a story about a second grade Joel who loved to wear sweatpants to school. Now, I'm in a situation. But it's almost the end of the day. So I'm like, okay, I will just ride this out. I don't have to get up. I don't have to move. I can just stay in my seat. Now, one thing you also need to understand about me is as a kid, I loved the affirmation that I got from teachers. And I was kind of what you call a teacher's pet. So when Mrs. Lechner looked at me and said, Joel, would you pass out the math assignment? There's a deep existential crisis that's happening right here. Because if I look at that teacher and I say, no, I'm being disobedient. But if I get up, the lid's gonna blow off this situation. Do you get what I'm saying? I chose obedience. Because maybe it's not that bad, right? So I'm passing out papers, and Jason kind of like looks around, and then he looks at me, and he goes, Joel, did you poop your pants? And I'm like, and Mrs. Lechner looks over, and suddenly she realizes we've got a situation. And Mrs. Lechner is a new teacher, so she doesn't know what to do. She's kind of freaking out, so she just kind of pulls me out into the hallway, brings me, and she kind of is looking at me. She doesn't know what to do. I don't know what to do. These are muddy waters. We've never been here before. So there we stood on that brown Tuesday, just looking at one another. And she's just looking at me. She goes, Joel, what happened? I looked at her. I'm like, I thought it was going to be silent. I don't know, like. So my mom comes to pick me up, and she's getting me in the car, and I go to sit down. And she's like, no, just wait, honey. And she starts laying down paper towels that she had grabbed from the bathroom. You know, they're just slightly thicker than the towels you actually have to use to dry off after a shower here. And I sit down, and it's just awful. I go home, I'm home for a couple of days. And I come back to school. But when I came back to school, nobody wants to be friends with the kid who pooped his pants. Let me tell you a story about how later on that year I brought in my favorite treat for my birthday. Did you do this in elementary school? You get to bring in your treat, the thing you love the most, and share it with your class. We got to do that, and I brought in this treat, and I watched as every person in the class took it and threw it in the garbage. I'll tell you a story about how in third grade, we sat in little pods, the teacher pushed our desks together. And for a month and a half, everybody else at my table, the other three people, put up their folders because they didn't want to look at my face. That's what they said. We don't want to look at your face all day. And the teacher let them stay up for a month and a half. So every day I went into school, and I didn't look at anybody, and I didn't talk to anybody. And it was in third grade that I told myself a story. You are worthless. No one likes you. You don't belong. You have no place. And that story continued to just get ingrained more deeply into my heart every single time that I said it. Until I got into fifth grade and realized that if I started acting out and instead of being a teacher's pet, I was disruptive and unruly, that maybe people would like me. But not because they liked me, but because I was the kid who did crazy stuff. And so I told myself a new story. People will only like you if you do the stuff nobody else will do, if you push the limits, if you push the boundaries, if you get in trouble. And so that's what I started to do. And that story, people will only like you if, that story of conditional love became ingrained pretty deeply into my heart. And I attached my worth to what other people said and what other people thought. I'll tell you a story about how in college I was diagnosed with major depression and anxiety. Finally going to a doctor and explaining some of the ways I had felt and having somebody look at me and say, that's not a normal way to feel. Maybe a manifestation of some biology caused by some circumstances in my life and the stories that I was telling. And at the core of it was this lie: you're not good enough unless. People won't love you unless. You'll only be worthy and you'll only belong if. Those are some pretty heavy stories. And it's not that that day in second grade maybe changed everything, but perhaps that was the moment or the start of when something big happened. I've got a little 5-year-old boy, his name's Elijah, and I'm becoming so aware of all the little things that can happen in our lives that can have such a profound and lasting impact on us, that we don't really even realize the cracks that they cause until we see them in big ways later on. You know, at the core of all of that, as I was going through college and wrestling with depression and going to therapy and looking at a lot of areas in my life like that, this question started to come up as a person of faith. I went to a Steubenville conference when I was a freshman in high school, and it changed my life. I gave my life to Jesus. I started to follow him as a disciple, not perfectly, but I tried the best that I could. And as I drew deeper into my faith, this question started to surface as I looked at some areas of my life like that, and I was like, Jesus, where were you, when that happened? You calmed the sea. You couldn't have calmed my intestines for just 3 hours. You couldn't have just been peace, be still. Even in bigger things, where were you when I was hurt after that relationship? Where were you, when I got into trouble? Where were you when I made that decision? Couldn't you have done something? And even in that moment, wrestling with depression, saying, Lord, couldn't you do something about this? And I don't think that I'm alone in that. I bet if you think about it, we all have instances in our life that if we really sat down and sort of followed the cracks back, we'd locate different areas where like something happened, and maybe that question is surfaced for you. Like, Jesus, where were you exactly? Like, when that happened? You know, where were you when all of that stuff went down? And sometimes it's just something really little. We follow those cracks back, and it's something so stupid and silly that somebody said that really had more of a lasting impact than they ever intended. A friend of mine at work, we were swapping stories about like little things like this, and he said that his older sister said as he was singing, you know, you're not as good of a singer as dad. Like, what a dumb thing. But it's something siblings say, and sometimes siblings say stupid things, right? But he heard, you're not a good singer. He's like, I didn't sing for like the next 10 years. Maybe you've had something like that, where somebody said something just so small, but it just really impacted you. Another person shared this story about how they were driving in California, and her dad said something like, wow, people out are sure in shape, kind of poking fun at the real heavy fitness lifestyle that exists out in California. And she looked out the window and saw this woman running, and in her mind, she's like, oh, so that's what in shape, that's what beautiful looks like. And for the next several years, she never felt worthy, because she told herself a story, that's what dad thinks is beautiful, that's what must be beautiful. And he never intended it that way. See, sometimes it's just something so small, but sometimes it's something a little bit bigger. Sometimes we go back and we look at an area of brokenness and we say, Jesus, where were you? Because maybe you're right now wrestling with depression or anxiety or mental illness the way that I did and I do. Maybe it was a moment where somebody really hurt you deeply. A moment where you had suffered at the hands of another person, that their sin impacted you and hurt you. Maybe it was a place where you experienced a very real death in your life, or the moment that your parents got a divorce, the moment that a parent got diagnosed with cancer, the moment they started to enter treatment for something that maybe looked like it would be terminal. And even maybe things got better, but that moment's still like it's with you. Maybe there are moments of actual death. And you follow the cracks back and you see like there's this place, there's this hurt, there's this brokenness where it feels like even a part of you died in that moment. You know, I look back and I make fun of that story about second grade, but here's the deal. A couple weeks ago when I was planning out this talk, I looked at my wife and I was like, I think I'm going to tell this story about pooping in second grade. And she was like, I'm like, I really don't want to do it. Like, why does that story evoke such a fear in me, like, in this moment? Because I'm like, I don't want to tell that on a stage in front of, like, 1,500 people, have it broadcast on YouTube where all the commenters can be like, poopy pants. It happens. Why does that still bring something up in me? Because something in me died when that happened. And it seems like, oh, man, like, you kind of get over it, but you don't. You know, Jesus is no stranger to death. And we think about Jesus and death in terms of death and resurrection. We often think about his big resurrection, right? Jesus dying on the cross. But what I love about the story of Jesus is that there's actually 3 times before Jesus dies that he raises somebody else from the dead. There's these 3 occasions, and one of them is with a family friend named Lazarus. And this comes in John chapter 11. And so if you want to pray with this later, I'm going to read some lines and I'm going to paraphrase some lines because it's a little bit longer of a narrative, but I think it's really worth going back to read. I'll let you know when I'm reading things exactly as they appear, because in this case, the words are really important. So this is John 11, and this is Jesus going to a place where there's death. A certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany. It was Mary, the village of Mary and his sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to Jesus saying, Lord, the one whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness is not until the death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by means of it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. What? Just think about this. So you're the disciples, right? You're with Jesus. And these family friends, close family friends, come to you and they're like, hey, Jesus, Lazarus, our brother who you love, we had that great picnic last summer. He's sick. And why are they sending to Jesus? Because they've seen him do miracles with the sick, right? Jesus heals people. And so they're like, oh, like even there may have been a sighs of relief, like when Lazarus got sick, like, oh, thank literally Jesus. We know him. We'll have him come and heal Lazarus, right? So they send for Jesus, And Jesus is like, oh, great. Well, this illness isn't to end in death. And all the disciples and the people that Mary and Martha send are like, whew, that's great news. And then he stays for 2 days longer. Like, if you're the disciples, what kind of conversations are you having in those 2 days? As Jesus is delayed, are you like, so should we bring this up? Should we tell him? Do you think it's just a cold? Like, why are we, get through lunch, dinner? Like, do you think he forgot? No, Jesus doesn't forget anything. So then eventually they decide that they're finally going to go. So Jesus says to them, let us go into Judea again. Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awake him out of sleep. And the disciples said to him, Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he will recover. So the disciples hear and they're like, oh, thank goodness, he's just in a coma. We'll go wake him out of a coma. He'll be great. He'll be fine. And I love this particular line. This is exactly in Scripture. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. Like, I just have this image of Jesus, like frustrated Jesus, where the disciples say something, he's like, oh, goodness. Yeah, that's great. Because they're over-spiritualizing it a little bit. So Jesus is like, oh, yeah, Lazarus has fallen asleep. And the disciples are like, oh, yes, he's fallen asleep. Oh, then he will rise again, Master, of course, And Jesus is like, Lazarus is dead, guys. So then they kind of speak up, and Thomas, called the twin, said, I doubt it. I'm kidding. He didn't say that. That's not in there. Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let us also go, that we may die with him. It's so funny. It's like over-spiritualization, Well, our friend Lazarus is dead. And Thomas is like, yes, let's go to and die with him. And he's looking at Jesus like, I don't know, he's crazy. So they go. When Jesus came, he found Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him while Mary sat in the house. And that's a fun little detail. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha said, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Now Martha's over-spiritualizing things. Have you ever done this? Where there's an area of healing that you need, but you're so afraid to ask Jesus for it that instead of being like, Jesus, can you heal this area? You're like, I know, Lord, all things will be made well on the last day when you wipe away every tear from their eyes, and it'll all be good. And it's a way of dismissing what Jesus can do and what Jesus wants to do. So Mary, or Martha, doesn't have big expectations for Jesus. She's just kind of like, yeah, I know that one day he'll rise again. When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying quietly, the teacher is here and is calling for you. Now again, let's paint a picture. Martha goes out, runs and meets Jesus, but Mary doesn't. She sits at home. And I can gauge and just guess and use a little bit of imagination that Mary probably isn't pleased with Jesus. They send for Jesus, and instead of running out to meet him, she's just sitting at home. And I imagine the messenger coming in and be like, hey, Martha comes in to her sister Mary, hey, Jesus is here now? And Mary being like, oh, he is. He's here several days late. Yeah, let's go have a talk with Jesus. So she comes out, and she goes up to Jesus. Is exactly what it says in the Gospel of John. When she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. And then she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And that's it. That's all she says. So Martha goes to Jesus and is like, hey, if you'd have been here, my brother wouldn't have died. But I know, one day he'll rise again. Mary just goes and says, if you'd have been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And that's it. Sometimes we do that. Lord, if you had been here, if you'd just been here, if you just showed up. But you didn't. So Jesus says, where have you laid Lazarus? And they say, Lord, come and see. Verse 35, Jesus wept. There is, I don't think, any more profound verse worthy of reflection than that verse. Because here's the thing, Jesus knows what he's going to do, right? He is well aware that he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead. He knows it. He says it at the beginning, I'm going to go. This isn't to end in death, it's for the glory of God. So Jesus knows the end of the story. Spoiler alert, right? And yet he goes to this tomb and has a visceral human reaction Do you know that actual tears, not like fake tears or fake crying, but real tears, are a response of the limbic system? It's a part of the automated nervous system, which means that you cannot control crying. Like that type of tears, that type of emotional weeping just happens to you. And that's what's happening to Jesus. He goes and has an emotional response. Why? Because Jesus is fully human as he is fully divine. And he breaks down and weeps. He's sad at what he sees. He's brokenhearted because other people are brokenhearted. Even though he knows there's about to be resurrection, he still feels so deeply with the people there and the hurt that they feel that he breaks down and weeps. What does it mean that God weeps? What does that look like? I am an ugly crier. I don't cry often, but when I do, there is snot and bloodshot eyes, and it is disgusting. Everything. Stuff comes out of my ears. It's disgusting. What does the face of a crying Christ look like? So Jesus asked them to take away the stone. And they say, that's not a good idea. He's been dead for 4 days, and this tomb is in the hot Judean countryside. Do that math, Jesus. And Jesus, in the scripture, it says, there will be a stench. And Jesus then prays to God. They roll away the stone, and he says, Lazarus, come out of there. And the dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with bandages, and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, unbind him and let him go. Jesus comes knowing what he's going to do, and yet he still feels suffering in this moment. But it gets deeper than that. Jesus resurrects Lazarus, but Lazarus is going to die again. Like Lazarus doesn't stay resurrected. He doesn't get eternal life. He's going to have a second death. But Jesus is about to save him from that too. If you were to go on and read in the Gospel of John in chapter 12, you would then read this account of the council getting together that's going to put Jesus to death. Because this story in the Gospel of John is what finally does Jesus in. It's the last straw. We can't have this Jesus going around forgiving sins. And now he's raising people from the dead, or whatever that even looks like, and they determine that it's better, and this is in the Gospel of John chapter 12, for one man to die than for a whole nation to suffer. It is the raising of Lazarus from the dead that gets Jesus killed. Sometimes you may hear from a stage somebody say, you know, even if you were the only person in the world, God would still die for you. And this is your proof text, because that's where Jesus does. If Jesus doesn't go to raise Lazarus from the dead, if he goes and just heals him from being sick, or he doesn't go at all, he just lets Lazarus stay dead, Jesus may not get arrested. Jesus may not have to suffer and die, and he knows all of that, and that's the deeper piece. This isn't to end in death. It's so that the Son of Man may be glorified. And Jesus is glorified on the cross. It's a one-for-one exchange for Lazarus. Jesus doesn't just, give him new life. Jesus trades in his life. He knows what's going to happen after this happens. And he does the same thing for you and for me. And here's what's incredible. Jesus doesn't wait for you and me to be perfect for it to happen. Jesus does it when we're imperfect and when we're flawed and we're screwing up. Jesus gives us a gift even though he knows we might reject it. Because Jesus wants to go to the tomb where you're broken and heal it. Jesus wants to trade his life for yours so that you would belong to him and get what belongs to him, which is life eternal. You and me were sinners, and our sin has broken us, but we've also been broken by the sin of others. We can't escape the reality that there are tombs in our life that we've walled up and we've sealed out because we don't want to look at it anymore. You've got an area of brokenness that maybe you have been thinking about since the moment you got here. Maybe you haven't touched it in a long time. But that particular place, we don't like to deal with them, so we put them in tombs. We say that area of my life is dead. My relationship with my parents, it's dead. That time that I was hurt, it just is over, and I'm going to put it away. That moment I fell into that sin for that first time, that I became addicted, the last time that I fell to that sin, most recently, I'm just going to put it in a tomb and I'm going to wall it up because I don't think that God can touch that. So I'm going to leave it there and I'm going to be dead there, and that's the way it's going to be. And then we sometimes go back to that tomb and we wonder, where was God when that happened? Where did he go? Why didn't he show up on time? And here's the crazy thing. If we actually were to go back and be attentive, you would find Christ there, weeping, broken, suffering. Jesus is at the tomb where you have placed your brokenness. And he's waiting for you to show up so he can call you to rise. Jesus is weeping at the tomb of your brokenness, and he calls you to rise. But it requires you to go there and meet him. And some of you are like, I don't want to open up that tomb, though. Yeah, it stinks. Literally, it stinks to go back and dig up that memory and offer that back to God. As though God doesn't know what's behind the door of that tomb. Jesus knows that Lazarus is in there. He knows he's been dead for 4 days. He knows what lies in your heart. He knows the area of brokenness. And Jesus tonight wants to heal it. He wants you to roll back that stone, to be vulnerable and break down the wall and let him in, so that he can begin to bring healing and resurrection. And I believe that tonight, if you let Jesus in, there will be resurrection. There will be healing. His grace is sufficient for you. Yeah, but what if it doesn't all end perfect, though? I will be completely candid with you. There are moments in your life that you will be healed spontaneously, where you will stand up and walk, and where life will never be the same. And there are moments that you will be healed and the grace will be present in an instant. And Jesus will look at you and say, you need to be unbound. I've prayed to God often to relieve the burden of depression and anxiety from my life in an instant. And it is possible that it will be something that always exists in my life. And that will be a mystery. Even up until 20 minutes before giving this talk, just dealing with, and I know some of you can relate to this, just waves of anxiety. I don't want to go on the stage. I don't want to talk. I don't want to be up there and share. I don't want to put myself out there. I don't want to be vulnerable with these stories. A couple of weeks ago, just kind of falling to a low place again and having some of those depressive symptoms manifest. And I know some of you know what I mean. And for me, that is a process where I have to seek more than just relying. I have to rely on the grace of Christ and then use it to seek additional help with people he has graced with the gifts and talents to unbind me. It doesn't mean that Christ's grace isn't sufficient. It means that my depression and anxiety is how Jesus Christ is saving me right now. It is the method by which I experience his love in a profound and real way. It is where I go to a tomb and he sits there weeping and he embraces me as we weep together and says, I feel every bit of pain you feel. It is the wound in which I encounter the love of my Christ in a profound and mysterious way. And as a result, I choose to go to people who have been given expertise and gifts and talents to help unravel some of the physical realities that means to you. And that might be the case for some of you. Tonight you'll experience healing, and it means going home and finding a counselor, finding a therapist, talking to an adult, working through a process, going through a 12-step program, reconciling with somebody, or just writing a note to let it go and beginning the process of forgiveness, which sometimes takes time. We can give up on the grace of Jesus, which is sufficient, because we want it to be something that happens in an instant, and resurrection does. And the grace keeps us through that unbinding process. Of those 3 resurrection stories, there's always an action that happens after the person's resurrected. A little girl rises from the dead, and Jesus says, give her something to eat. A son is risen from the dead, and Jesus says, give him to his mother. There's always another step. And we get frustrated with Jesus, and we think Jesus doesn't heal us because we just don't want the other step. Grace is here tonight, and we don't want to roll away the stone because we're afraid of what the smell is like. We're afraid of what it means to be unbound. We don't want to take the bandages off, but you need to. Because Jesus wants to save you. Because you were made to be whole and alive and full. Not dead. Jesus didn't cause whatever happened in your life, no more than he caused that illness for Lazarus. And I want to point that out. At the very beginning, you'll notice that Jesus says Lazarus is ill. He doesn't say, I made Lazarus ill. But I am going to go make it right, make it well. I'm going to use it for the glory of God, just like he's going to use that tomb to glorify himself in your life. And that glory will be the relationship. But you got to go there tonight. I'm going to tell you a story. And I'm going to tell you the ending. Jesus Christ has conquered sin and death. He's seen every broken piece of your life, and he wants to raise it up. He wants to heal it and bring new life there. He wants to do great things with the cool parts of your life, but those areas of brokenness, that's where the divine physician shines. I'm going to tell you a story about a Savior who's been standing at that empty tomb weeping, waiting for you to go there and encounter him so that he can bring resurrection and hope and new life. Because in Jesus Christ, there is no death, only resurrection. Jesus stands at the tomb of your brokenness, and he's going to call you to rise. I want you to pray with me for a second. And to do that, I want you to close your eyes because we're going to walk through that story. We're going to walk through that story of what it means to approach that tomb. So I want you to imagine what it is. And as I've been speaking, you know what that tomb is. You know what you've put behind that stone. And I want you to imagine walking there. I want you to think about all of the ways that makes you feel, about all of the emotions that's bringing up. Maybe all of the responses you've had to that situation, like maybe like Martha, where you've said, I just kind of passed it off. I don't want to think about it anymore, so I've just told Jesus, I'm sure it's all going to be okay. We don't need to open that up. We don't need to go back there. I'll just move on. Maybe you've been more like Mary, where you've just been angry with the Lord. When you think about that thing, you're fine in all other aspects, but when you think about that thing, you're like, but that one thing, why weren't you here? I want you to imagine walking up to that tomb and Jesus is there, and he's been weeping. He's been crying at that spot, waiting for you, because when you hurt, he hurt. When those words were said to you, they were said to him. When you fell to that sin that was the first time you were going to fall, to a sin that would become a vice, that would become something destructive, he was there watching it happen and saying, I can still bring mercy. I can still bring mercy. I can still bring mercy. The first time, the 100th time, the 1000th time. And he's there crying because he wants to look at you and say, I can still bring mercy, but you need to come here. He's there weeping because he said, every time you had a panic attack, I was curled up next to your bed with you, holding you while you shook. He's saying every time you had those thoughts about how you were worthless, I only thought about how much you were worth. And I'm here now. And I know it's back there. And it's not meant to remain death. It's meant to become life for you. Jesus, perhaps with tears still in his eyes, is going to look at you and say, this may take some time. But I'm not walking away after this moment. I'm not walking away when you leave Steubenville. I'm not walking away after adoration tonight. I am with you every step of the way. I'm the compassionate one. I weep with those who weep, and I call the dead to rise. And that's when he's going to look at you. Look back at him. And he's going to say that area of brokenness is not to be your death. Roll away the stone and rise.